To go after Canadians for donating to a cause that the Prime Minister really hates, this is fascism. Where the dictator gets to use government power to punish you for disagreement. This is cracking down on dissent. This is incredibly dangerous. So yeah, we are, again, halfway, a third of the way, we are sliding into totalitarianism when you've got politicians abusing their political power to literally punish people. I mean, what's your life going to be like when your bank account's frozen and your credit card is taken away or frozen? You can't buy groceries. You can't buy medicine for your kids. Your car insurance is taken away, frozen, so you cannot legally drive your car. This is what the government has inflicted on hundreds of innocent Canadians who have done nothing wrong, who exercise their freedom as citizens to donate to convoy, to the Freedom Convoy. So that's pretty scary. And the government wants to make those powers permanent, where they can just simply, well, we don't like your politics. We don't like who you gave money to, so we're freezing your bank account. It's halfway there to totalitarianism, yes.
In response to 2 years of overbearing COVID-19 restrictions, truckers took to blockade borders and occupied the area around Parliament in Ottawa, and in response to their peaceful protest, Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act.
As you likely know, there has been an update since we filmed this video. Faced with the possibility of Senate, and yes, even Liberal-appointed senators, voting against Justin Trudeau's outlandish invocation of the Emergencies Act, our tin pot Prime Minister folded and revoked the order in a shameless ploy to save face. No one bought the act, of course, and Justin was indeed wearing egg on his face. This mere days after the NDP and Liberals alike voted in haunting uniformity in the House of Commons to maintain the absurd Emergencies Act. The incident was especially embarrassing for NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, who was broadly derided for ramping up Trudeau's despotic disposition, and all for 2 more days of overbearing state power. So the Emergencies Act has been revoked, but it is still important for us to have these conversations and to ask why it was so easy for Justin Trudeau to seize control of Canada. Adam Soos here for Rebel News, and I am joined by the president of the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, John Carpay, to discuss the Emergencies Act that has been implemented by Justin Trudeau and is currently being voted on. It already made its way through the House of Commons and is being discussed by the Senate. For all we know, by the time you're watching this, Senate has voted on it, so this information may need to be updated. But I want to get into the Emergencies Act itself. And first off, I wanted to ask you, John, is the Emergencies Act under the conditions right now in Canada justifiable at all?
No, because it's lacking a factual basis. So in order for there to be a national emergency, you need a serious threat to either the life, safety, or health of Canadians, which peaceful protesters in Ottawa were not causing a serious threat to the life or health or safety of Canadians, or the alternative that the peaceful protesters in Ottawa were causing a serious threat to the ability of the government of Canada to preserve the security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Canada. So, I mean, it's just absurd that, yes, I'm sure that Ottawa residents, some of them, not all of them, but some Ottawa residents suffered some inconvenience, but there was no blockade. And the Rebel knows this. You've had your reporters there. There was no blockade. There was no siege. You could walk from one end of downtown to the other end of downtown until police set up the perimeter that turned it into a bit of a blockade. But prior to police doing that, so the factual basis is not there for saying that there is a national emergency, because there is not a serious threat to the security, sovereignty, or territorial integrity of Canada. And then the last point on that, according to the Act, it's only a national emergency if the existing federal, provincial, municipal laws cannot deal with the situation. Well, if the truckers were illegally parked, they could have been issued parking infractions. If they were in violation of the traffic laws, they could have been issued traffic tickets. If there was any basis for criminal charges, and we saw no criminal charges laid in the first 3 weeks, that could have been done. So there's just no factual basis to justify it.
Well, we even saw crime actually decrease in Ottawa during the time, as opposed to, say, like a Chaz zone in Seattle or something. Or Portland rather, we saw crime decrease. One of the things, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm living in fantasy land, but the justification for these originally was not in fact what was happening in Ottawa. It was largely about the blockades and the capacity to cross the border. Those issues in largely Alberta were resolved prior to the Emergencies Act, or not with consideration of the Emergencies Act. It was the provincial enforcement that effectively resulted in that. So what is the justification? Or I mean, I suppose you're saying there isn't any, but what sort of justification could there possibly be once the blockades are gone to sustain this Emergencies Act?
Well, that's what's so profoundly troubling about this. There could arguably potentially have been some grounds for declaration of a national emergency with there were border blockades in Alberta and Manitoba and Ontario, there in 3 places. All 3 of those came down and the borders reopened prior to the Prime Minister declaring a national emergency. The other thing that's relevant here is that within the past 2 years, we've had protesters that actually were blockading, was within the past 2 years for environmental issues, for Aboriginal issues. People were shutting down railroad lines. Mm-hmm. There was food rotting in ports and harbors because the trains were not moving to take supplies into Canada. What did the federal government do? Nothing. I mean, they didn't even, they just kind of sat back and watched it happen, let it happen. They didn't even use enforcement mechanisms against it. And they certainly didn't declare that it was a national emergency. So it's completely offside to now hear governments talking about how, oh, this is hurting the Canadian economy and it's disrupting supply lines and, this is endangering people's food supplies. I mean, it was just, makes me think of the old maxim, the big lie works better than the small lie. The big lie is more powerful and effective. And you've got the federal government coming out with some very big lies that seem to mesmerize a lot of people.
And the other sort of shocking thing, and this is a bit of an aside though, is there is this new Critical Infrastructure Defense Act that hasn't been implemented in many of these cases. But now Pastor Artur Pawlowski, who dared to go down to Coutts briefly and pray and then departed, he's the first person in history in this province to be charged under the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. What ultimately, I suppose, both legally and politically, how have the standards slipped so far? Like this to me seems a sort of bizarro world, that these things that simply don't make any sense are being upheld both by politicians, particularly the Liberals and the NDP, and then the judicial system in this country.
Well, there's 2 problems. One is with the rule of law. The rule of law means that the law applies equally to everybody, even the king, even the prime minister. So what the rule of law should mean is that there's one standard for upholding or shutting down political protests, and it doesn't matter what the cause is. So it doesn't matter whether you're a pro-lifer that's picketing outside of an abortion clinic, or whether you're an Aboriginal or environmentalist, protesting about some oil and gas project, whether you're a trucker in Ottawa or elsewhere protesting for the return of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we lost 23 months ago, that it doesn't matter what your cause is, there should be the same standard applied to everybody. So that's one problem. We have a breakdown of the rule of law when you have people, Black Lives Matters type protesters that are destroying public property, tearing down a statue of Queen Victoria at the Manitoba legislature while police stood by and watched. There's a double standard, and that's extremely dangerous for society. It makes people respect the law less because the law is seen as a joke. Because if you're protesting for a politically correct cause, you can do whatever you want. You can destroy property, you can vandalize, you can tear down memorials, you can block railroads, do whatever you want if you're protesting for something that Trudeau likes. But if you're peacefully protesting for something that Trudeau dislikes, you're going to be subjected to police brutality. Mm-hmm. That is a scary, very scary place where you're going to have less respect for the law when you have that double standard. So there should be the same standard for everybody. Peaceful protest should not cause, it shouldn't obstruct other people going about their lives, going about their business, right? So if I want to express my opinions, it should not interfere with you going to work, going shopping, taking care of your family. It should not interfere with your life. Now, it might inconvenience you if you don't like the sign that I'm holding up. You might find it really offensive, okay? That's part of living in a free society. So it's okay if I upset you emotionally because you really can't stand what I'm saying. That's okay. But the moment I block you from getting into your car to go pick up your kids from school or go to work, then it's a problem. So that should be the same standard for everybody, regardless of your cause. You don't block and obstruct other people from going about their business.
Yeah, and that the issue there is we've seen groups doing that over and over again, and there's no consequences. Suddenly, a group does it for a cause like their charter rights, and it's shut down and entirely unacceptable. It's interesting that you mentioned the statues being defaced, because we literally saw statues destroyed and defaced, and that was okay. We saw also churches burnt down, and according to Justin Trudeau, that was understandable. But
he said it was wrong, but then he said, we can kind of understand why they're doing it.
And then conversely, you see a Terry Fox statue adorned with a flag and a sign. A couple months before, it was adorned with a mask. So when they adorned it with a mask, that was adorning. When they put a flag and a sign on it, that was defacing. So there's this clear double standard, and very much the expression, the fish rots from the head. Justin Trudeau, he's been the sort of the key propagandist in this rhetoric. He has called people standing up for their charter enshrined freedoms racists, misogynists, sexists,
anti-science, extremists,
exactly,
who should not be tolerated. Yeah.
And so what's the precedent for this? Because I really, as far as official leadership having such outlandish claims about a group in Canadian history. I mean, obviously there's been instances of racism, but like Japanese internment is probably one of the only other times in history where the government engaged in propaganda against a group of people on this level.
Yeah, that one comes to mind historically. We have to remember as well, the last time that a national emergency was invoked, and it was under similar legislation, but different, the War Measures Act. Mm-hmm. At that time, and people still debate whether it was validly enacted or not. The NDP was certainly against the use of the War Measures Act in 1970. But in October of 1970, you had the Front de Libération du Québec, the Quebec Liberation Front, or the FLQ, and they were putting bombs in mailboxes, bombs in cars, bombs in the home of Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau, a bomb set off in the Montreal Stock Exchange. And then in 1970, they kidnapped two government officials. One of them, both of them they held for ransom. One of them they killed. Yeah. And then Pierre Elliott Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, and so hundreds of people, I think like 497 people, were arrested if they were even suspected of having any tie to the FLQ. Now, people can still debate whether that was valid or not, but one thing that people can agree on, though, is that there was a serious, there was actual violence, kidnapping, murder, a terrorist organization that wanted to violently overthrow the elected Quebec government and set up an independent socialist Quebec. So compare that to a bunch of truckers causing some inconvenience to some Ottawa residents. It's just no comparison.
And then in terms of no comparison, we've also seen these shocking denials of bail. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the individual who rammed someone in Winnipeg, they received bail, but a peaceful organizer on just a charge of conspiracy to commit mischief, I believe, Tamara Litch, denied bail. Pastor Artur Pawlowski, foregoing and preaching, denied bail. Are these people being held effectively for thought crimes? Because, I mean, violent criminals are being released. These people are not.
But to me, it just looks like political prisoners. I mean, Tamara Leach does not own a truck. I think the section of the criminal code that the police were relying on is section 430, section 430, which is mischief, which is to interfere with the lawful use and enjoyment of property. Now, I can't predict whether these charges are going to hold water against truckers, okay? So if a trucker is accused of interfering with the lawful enjoyment and use of property and obstructing people from using their property, okay, that would be the criminal charge of mischief. We'll have to wait and see whether any of these truckers are convicted or acquitted. But then to charge somebody with counseling this, it is so far removed from reality. And then to deny bail, this has, what it looks like is they're trying to censor her, because I gather when you're in prison and you don't have your computer or your smartphone, you can't be speaking publicly anymore the way that you could before. Yeah. So I think that this looks like, we look like we're sinking into becoming like a banana republic with polar bears, where we've got political prisoners who are people that the regime dislikes because of their public criticism.
Well, and you look at the case of Pastor Artur Pawlowski, the people who are blockading the border have not been charged under the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, but the pastor who visited them for one afternoon has. So they're clearly not enacting on the infractions. They're not law enforcing based on the actual, even if it's just by the letter of the law and the spirit isn't necessarily there, they aren't enforcing against those people. They're enforcing against ideology and ideas. And that's why we're seeing Tamara Lich, Pastor Artur Pawlowski, and some of these other people targeted, vilified, and now for Pastor Artur Pawlowski, his fifth arrest, third time behind bars. Incredibly shocking. You did touch on it there briefly, but if you could just recap, for folks out there, I think many Canadians, many starting to wake up now. We've seen protests growing and growing. But we've had very safe lives. Many of us, according to surveys and research, don't recall quite what the Nazis did. They don't understand. There's a trend towards favoring communism, despite it having killed hundreds of millions of people. Just looking at the historical legal precedent, how far has Canada gone from one of the sort of bastions of freedom in the world to a completely fallen state with lawlessness and tyrants?
That's an excellent question. It's hard to say, are we a third of the way there, 2/3 of the way there? I would say we may well be halfway there. What we still have is a large amount of freedom of speech. That's not to deny that cancel culture is a problem, but the fact that you and I are having this interview, that it will be seen by people, that you and I are not likely to get thrown in jail because of this interview. So we still have a lot of free speech left. Mm-hmm. So that's very positive. We still have a large amount of freedom of association. But what's really terrifying is the government freezing bank accounts for purely political reasons. People that donated to Freedom Convoy, and there are hundreds of Canadians whose bank accounts have been frozen. Fortunately, we've had reports in the last day or so that some of these accounts are being unfrozen now. This is for giving money to a political cause that people agreed with. They wanted to support the truckers. The truckers were peaceful. They were nonviolent. To go after Canadians for donating to a cause that the Prime Minister really hates, this is fascism. Where the dictator gets to use government power to punish you for disagreement. This is cracking down on dissent. This is incredibly dangerous. So yeah, we are, again, halfway, a third of the way. We are sliding into totalitarianism when you've got politicians abusing their political power to literally punish people. I mean, what's your life going to be like when your bank account's frozen and your credit card is taken away or frozen? You can't buy groceries. You can't buy medicine for your kids. Your car insurance is taken away, frozen, so you cannot legally drive your car. This is what the government has inflicted on hundreds of innocent Canadians who have done nothing wrong, who exercise their freedom as citizens to donate to convoy, to the Freedom Convoy. So that's pretty scary. And the government wants to make those powers permanent, where they can just simply, well, we don't like your politics. We don't like who you gave money to, so we're freezing your bank account. It's halfway there to totalitarianism, yes.
Well, it's shocking, and it's certainly sad to see. Hopefully, people out there wake up to this daunting reality. Canadians very fortunate to have you, John Carpay, and the folks at the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedom standing up for their charter rights. And for everyone out there, as always, Rebel News is going to continue to tell the other side of the story, continue to use our freedom of speech. John, thank you so much. And everyone out there, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. You know, John is absolutely right. We are lucky in Canada that we still have our freedom of speech, at least to some extent. But those freedoms are under attack, and it is absolutely paramount that we have strong independent media that's not paid off by the state, that can tell the other side of the story and ask tough questions of the government and of the powers that be that other people simply are not willing to ask. If you want to support strong, independent journalism, go to rebelnews.com and subscribe to Rebel News Plus to keep us out there asking the questions that need to be asked.